Hello, everybody. Okay, so this is a combined video for the 7th and 8th graders because both of you are coming up on your writing units. The 7th graders have a narrative writing unit and the 8th graders have an informative writing unit, which is awesome because then that means we get to compare and contrast them, okay? So the last video I posted was some do's and don'ts about writing, like do write like a professional at all times, always use transitions, and understand your style. But I also said don't wing it. And Google is not a source, it's a search engine. Okay, so if you're citing something in the informational paper, your source shouldn't be Google. Okay, that's not a source, it's a search engine. Okay, moving on from that. I'm going to compare narrative and informative writing and what the big differences are and what you need to do to make sure that you're writing narratively or informatively correctly. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to talk about is the purpose. Author's purpose, specifically the purpose of writing narratively and writing informationally. When you are writing an informational paper, the purpose is to inform, obviously, right? That means that you want the person reading your paper to understand more about the topic. That does not mean you are trying to convince them of something. Okay, you're not fighting to prove something. In an argumentative paper, you have to use complex ideas like ethos, pathos, and logos, which we're not covering right now, but trust me, they're complex ideas that help you prove something, okay? In an informational paper, you don't actually have to prove anything. You just have to present the information in a way that's easy to understand. Now, some of your information may need to be backed up by claims. So if you say greenhouse gases are rising at a rate of 200% per year, you're going to need to cite where that information came from. Otherwise, whoever is reading your informational paper may not trust that information. Okay, so it's not about belief. It's not about convincing somebody to think something. It's just about making sure that they know they can trust you. That's all. All right. Whereas narrative writing is very much the opposite. In narrative writing, you don't need to communicate every idea perfect and clean. Instead, your primary purpose is to entertain. With narrative writing, your goal is that the reader is wrapped up in a story and wants to continue to the end. Okay, so yes, your information should be accurate in the sense that it's internally consistent. Whatever you write in one paragraph should make sense with the next. So for instance, if you're writing a story about a medieval knight, okay, and he's going to save the princess, he shouldn't be calling the princess on his cell phone. That doesn't make any sense, right? That's not consistent. So the story is going to fall apart. You should be consistent to your setting, consistent to your characters. All right, so that is the purpose difference between the two. One is to inform, and the other is to entertain. Okay, so how does that actually affect how you write? Well, it comes down to structure. Structure is the way that your paper is organized and how information is conveyed. Okay, it's very different between narrative and informative. In an informative paper, you decide the order that the information is presented. That could be order of importance, or that could be most interesting, or it could be most relevant, okay? Whatever order you decide is most important. That is what you can do. You can decide in your paper on climate change that you want to talk about the Antarctic ice sheet first, or you can talk about emissions first, whatever. Whatever helps you get your information across in the most efficient order possible. That's what matters. Whereas in a narrative, it should probably follow a pretty chronological order. You don't necessarily have to stick chronological, but you probably should make it at least mostly chronological so that people can understand what's going on easily. We perceive time as a line. We wake up in the morning feeling like P. Diddy, and then we go to bed at night. That is the order of our lives. We travel one direction. That is how your story should also continue, unless you're doing something like a flashback or something, which in your short narrative essays, you probably should stay away from things like that. Okay, probably stick to a nice chronological order that somebody woke up, they ate breakfast, they ate lunch, they ate dinner, they went to bed. Okay, you don't mix it up and go all over the place. You should probably try to stick fairly straightforward in that chronological order. Okay, so the informative people, you eighth graders, have a lot more options on how you organize your information, which you may like and you may not like. Okay, you may not like that freedom. Whereas the narrative driven people, the seventh graders, you're going to have to write a story that should probably follow some kind of chronological order. And last, we have to talk about the tone and voice of your paper. Tone and voice are words that basically mean the way your paper comes across, the way that your narrative voice, the way that you sound as an author comes across to the reader. In an informational piece, that tone should be very professional and it should have no strong emotional value. Somebody shouldn't be reading an informational piece on like a presidential election and feel like the author has a very, very strong opinion on the matter. Because if they do, then that's an opinion piece, not an informative piece. And that author very clearly has bias. If you remember from one of our former lessons, we discussed how bias is the tendency for a person to believe one thing over another. So somebody who's biased towards a particular presidential candidate will not be able to write an informative paper unless they can defeat that bias and keep a professional tone. Whereas a narrative, if you're writing a story about how you met your favorite celebrity and you want to, talk about how amazing that situation was, then yeah, your narrative voice can be very excited. Maybe you miss them. Maybe you want to see them again someday. So your narrative voice becomes hopeful. Okay, so your tone can go all over the place. You can make your story sad or happy or even like somewhere in between, some sort of like melancholy or something dramatic. Narrative voice has far more options than informative, which basically just has to be professional. Sometimes you can sneak a little bit of humor in there. Good writers, especially news articles and whatnot, do tend to be able to sneak a little bit of lightheartedness and almost like a sense of camaraderie to the reader, to say like, hey, I'm somebody like you. And yes, you're getting this information, but you're getting it from somebody that you can trust. So sometimes people will slip that tone in, but most of the time, you're looking at a pretty straightforward professional tone for your informative pieces and any tone you want for your narrative pieces. But what exactly is tone? Like, how does it come across to a reader? I'm going to give you an example. Okay, I'm going to put an example up on the board here of two different emails. One email is being sent from a parent to a teacher, and the other email is also being sent from a parent to a teacher. Both are about a student who is not completing their work in class, but one has a very aggressive tone, like the teacher is very clearly frustrated, and the other one has a very professional tone where the teacher is not frustrated. So you take a look at them and tell me whether or not you can see the difference. Were you able to figure it out? You should have said that email number one had the angry tone. Email number two has the professional tone. There's a few ways that you can tell. First off, the language, the word choice that the first email has is definitely more aggressive. So the teacher says things like, I'm not going to waste my time, versus on email number two, the teacher says, I can't afford to spend time helping students who won't do something. So one person is afraid of wasting time. The other person is concerned about how they spend their time, right? Which would you rather hear, right? If somebody's talking about time they spend with you, would you rather hear them say that they spend time with you or that they waste time with you, right? Waste has a very negative connotation. You remember connotation? Hopefully you do, because we did a lesson on it. And then we have this other phrase, John ignored his test versus John blew off his test. If you say John ignored his test, that is technically true. There's no way for somebody to say, no, they didn't ignore it. Like, no, he turned in a blank piece of paper. Those are the facts. Whereas if you say Johnny blew off his test, now it sounds like Johnny did it intentionally. Johnny did it in a way that was disrespectful. Okay. Ignoring a test because you're afraid of taking it is one thing, because the teacher doesn't know why Johnny did this. Okay. Maybe he just doesn't know the material. Okay. He ignored the test because he can't answer the questions. Whereas if you say he blew off the test, that's very different. That means he can answer it and the teacher knows that they can answer it, but the child chose not to do it. Okay. So if I were a parent receiving this email, I would much rather receive email number 2 than email number 1. Email number 1 would probably get me angry, and email number 2 would probably tell me that this teacher is doing the best they can and that I should probably help them. That is what tone is all about. So when you're writing a narrative, if you want your characters or even your author's voice to come across as angry, do it. You're not going to offend anybody. But if you're writing an informative piece, then it should definitely come across as professional as possible. And that is about all we have time for because this video is running long. So I'm going to cut it off right here. We have lots more videos to do, especially on the writing process. I want you guys to be able to edit and work on your papers in an efficient manner. So that's what I'm going to work on next. And I will see you all next time.